All right. Welcome back, participants. We are going to set up here for our final session of the morning with Leslie James, who's been teaching information literacy skills to students for 20 plus years. She started a career in that educational role for the Teen Services Librarian at the Douglas Truth branch of the Seattle Public Library. And then as a research specialist at the Bellevue Big Picture School, most recently at the Bush School, and then even more recently as the new Media Literacy Digital Citizenship Program Supervisor at OSPI. So I'm looking forward to having Leslie join us and talk to us specifically about some of the challenges of trying to address these curriculum and classes, and then to show us sort of the way forward. So Leslie, thank you for being here and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you for having me here. I'm really glad to be here. It is that last period before lunch. So I hope everybody has had a chance to do maybe a little stretch, grab some food, all that good stuff, and that you can see my screen okay. I'm going to dive right in so we can get to that lunch. A little bit about me, you just heard a little bit. I've had a lot of different titles. I definitely identify as a librarian. I've worked at public libraries, I've worked at schools, and I've spent a lot of time directly teaching students how to navigate this information landscape, and also helping teachers who are trying to do the same thing. And as you know, the information landscape has changed and will continue to change a lot. So our approaches to thinking about it and teaching about it constantly need to change as well. When I started planning this talk, the only hat that I was wearing at the moment was information literacy educator. But since then, as you just heard, in fact, quite recently, I've acquired this other hat. And I'm very excited about this new job. I'm just really glad and grateful that it exists at all. And I want you to know it's the result of legislation that was passed thanks to the tireless efforts of media literacy advocates in our state. So I'm very, very grateful to them. If you'd like to talk more about what this new job entails, not just for me, but for everyone, and also maybe you want to hear a little bit about the grant opportunity that I'm working on, please get in touch. I really hope that we can continue the conversation that's beginning today. And the main thing I'd like for us to have a conversation about today is the marriage between social studies teachers and information literacy, which means thinking critically about the information that we consume and produce. And that information, it might be a website that a student is considering using for a school paper. It might be a news story that they've encountered in one of the 8 million ways that news comes at us these days. It might be a meme that they saw posted on social media. Any of those are potential pieces of information that we want to think about really critically. So I have a lot of things to share with you about the marriage between social studies and information literacy, but I definitely also really want to hear from all of you as well. And one reason it should not just be my voice is that as a white, straight, neurotypical, cisgender woman, I view the world through particular lenses. And part of what we do as we navigate that information landscape is we adjust and expand our lenses. And so I hope that we can do that together. And I just want to take a moment. I would love for you to share what your relationship is with information literacy at the moment. So if you're willing, please type in the chat. Are you maybe just meeting information literacy for the first time? Are you still in the friend zone, but you're maybe thinking about taking it to the next level? Have you been dating for a while? Things gotten pretty serious. And if so, are things going smoothly? or have you maybe run into some rocky patches? So I'll pause for a moment. I would love to hear in the chat, what's your relationship like? Meeting for the first time, awesome. Oh, it's complicated. Yeah, that's a good one. That's a really good one. I love it. Some of you have been together for a while. I love that too. This is so awesome. Getting back into it, meeting for the first time. Ooh, maybe having some cold feet about it for sure. Like you want to really figure out what's going on. I love it. Ready to take it to the next level. Awesome. So I'm really glad to see we've got kind of a mix, which is, kind of what you expect. Oh, reevaluating a long time partnership. Hey, Paulette, I love it. These are great. These are really great. Yeah. And I think that it's complicated is something that we could all pretty much say is true about our relationship with this. So I love that more things are coming in. I'm going to move on to talk about how, as with any marriage or any close relationship, there are obstacles that get in the way of working together harmoniously. So today we are going to look at 5 obstacles and 8 solutions for overcoming those obstacles. But first, I would like to start with a few scenes from my actual marriage to my husband, Rob. In the summer of 2020, Rob and I were supposed to go on a trip to Portugal. We bought our airplane tickets, we reserved the hotels, we were going to do this amazing wine tasting tour on the River Douro, but then we didn't get to go. So on the day we were supposed to leave, I was feeling kind of sorry for myself. I knew there were a lot of people who were suffering way more than I was, but I had really been looking forward to that trip. So I decided to cheer myself up by posting this on Facebook. So that's me and my husband, Rob. It was photoshopped onto a picture of SeaTac Airport that I found on the internet. And it was sort of a memorial for the trip that never was. It was a way to share a bit of a bond with those other people who were also canceling their reservations and getting those airline vouchers. I deliberately, I don't know if you can tell, but I did the photoshopping as poorly as I possibly could. I didn't want anyone to think that this was real. You can probably see I included our cat Stella in my backpack. I hope that would be a dead giveaway that I was just having a little bit of bittersweet fun. Most of my friends got the joke, and that was part of the catharsis for me. But then I started to get comments like these. We had to cancel our trip. I'm jealous, have so much fun. I thought we were banned from Europe. So it may be a little hard for you to tell because you don't know these people. They were not getting the joke. And the trip to Portugal was supposed to last 17 days. I posted something like this every day. The stories got more and more outlandish. And this one, Stella the cat has gotten lost on the tram. The photoshopping got more and more atrocious. I used this exact same photo of us in every single post. And I still got comments. Wish I was there too. So envious. They let you in? We had to cancel our trip. So I posted right up until the very last day when we were allegedly flying home with some of these souvenirs that we had picked up on the trip. I got these comments, welcome back. I'm so glad you could get in, good for you. So these were smart people. Many of them were teachers. Some of them were social studies teachers, but they were fooled by my posts. I not only wasn't trying to fool them, I was doing my best to make it clear that this was a work of satire. So the last thing that I want to do is spread misinformation. So the question is, why? Why did some of my friends, my very smart, educated friends, why did they still end up believing that I had gone to Portugal with my cat during a global pandemic? So, but you can guess, I'm going to ask you to share in the chat. What are your thoughts? Why did smart people believe that these super fake posts were real? Take a couple moments. What do you think was going on for them? What were their thoughts? Yeah, not thinking about the context for sure. Ooh, they trusted me. Why would I lie to them? They're just scrolling through. They believe what they want to believe. Yes, yes, y'all. Yes, for sure. They wanted to believe I went on that trip. They're just going too fast for sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Some definitely got the joke. Some did not. Some didn't. Yeah. Yeah, it's just, it looks like I usually do go on trips and post things and they look very similar. Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yeah, it's like a passive activity. I like that. Yeah. They see me as a valid source. It's nice that they trust me so much that they think I wouldn't betray them. Absolutely. Yeah. Assuming absolutely. I'm going to move on and sum up some of these thoughts that you all are coming up with, because these are definitely the reasons that I came up with as well. They just didn't look carefully. They were going fast. They didn't fact check. They assumed I would be telling them the truth. Maybe they just don't have the same sense of humor that I have. But more seriously, they might have been having an emotional response, and that overwhelmed their common sense. Did you see how many of them said, I'm so jealous, I'm so envious, we had to cancel our trip? And like many of you have pointed out, oh, they wanted it to be true. And some of them were just inclined to believe that middle-class white people can go to Europe if they want to. All of these are really good reasons to come up with. And what we have here is an introduction to an information literacy lesson. This is how I have started things off with students. I thought it would be a good way for us to start, because it sparks some thinking about what we mean when we say we need to fight misinformation. It's also an example of using something relatively innocuous as a way to get started, because it won't scare off the kids whose hackles might go up when they hear that word, fighting misinformation. Now, I realize it's not very likely that many of you have also posted about a fake trip on Facebook and had all your friends be fooled. So here is an option that works for everybody. And this is the option I used to use before I had my fake Facebook trip. These are articles from The Onion, the satirical news site, that people have believed they were true. They post about them on social media. It's basically the same thing as my Facebook posts. Someone posts something that's supposed to be a joke, a work of satire, but then someone else believes it's true and says so in the replies to the post. This resource, how to find these believed Onion articles and everything else that I'm going to suggest and recommend, it's all in a takeaway handout. It's a Google Doc that you'll all have access to on that resource page. There's a whole collection of these believed Onion articles like this one. So examples like these can also help spark a conversation about why we fight misinformation. The Onion articles and my fake trip, they're relatively harmless. They didn't actually get seen by that many people, and not that many people believed them. And there really weren't any terrible consequences for people believing that I had gone to Portugal. But of course, you can imagine what happens when the stakes are higher. So when many more people are seeing the misinformation, when many more people are believing it, when the misinformation is much more plausible, when it is intended to fool people, when it is more deliberately misleading. So this can also be a way to segue into talking about the real world consequences of misinformation. This one wasn't that big a deal. What about these things? They're a bigger deal. So let's move on to another scene from the marriage between social studies and information literacy. This scene also features my husband, Rob, but this time it also features his colleagues, all of whom are super dedicated social studies teachers at a local high school. I don't have any pictures of the actual scene that I'm going to describe to you. So I found a picture of Rob and one of his colleagues on the internet, and you'll just have to use your imagination. Picture your own staff room, and there's a group of social studies teachers have gathered in the staff room. This particular scene takes place on January 6th, 2021. And Rob and his colleagues, his social studies teacher colleagues, they're having a department meeting about how to respond to the attack on the Capitol. All of them agree that an important part of that response has to be making sure students know how to recognize and fight back against misinformation, because misinformation was at the heart of what happened at the Capitol. But right away, they came face to face with their first obstacle: needing access to information literacy curriculum. Now, fortunately, there's so many awesome solutions to this obstacle. There's amazing curriculum out there. You have been encountering many, many examples in the sessions we've already had today. People have been putting things in the chat. I've got even more on the Google Doc that you'll be able to see. There is curriculum out there. Here's another solution that might work for you. Librarians. You may have a librarian at your school who would love to come in and teach some information literacy skills, or maybe there's one at your local public library who would shower you with gratitude if you invited them into your class. But however, it's true, not all librarians maybe are raring to go with the information literacy lessons. And unfortunately, there are some schools without librarians. So it is worth talking about how you can also overcome any obstacles in your way if you don't have the help of a trusty librarian. Okay, back to January 6th, in the social studies department meeting, and everyone agreed information literacy is important. They all agreed information literacy was important. They had access to curriculum. They had access to a librarian. And, but still, many of them brought up obstacles. And this, in almost every case, was the main obstacle they brought up. Now, I do not want to downplay the seriousness of this obstacle. You only have 36 weeks to get through a slew of social studies content, and those weeks start getting eaten away by assemblies and standardized tests and fire drills. And these days there are quarantines and all the other things that are not social studies. And now you're also being asked to give up some of that precious time to teach kids to think critically about information as well. Now, if you saw the blurb for this presentation, you might have seen that I said we were going to learn from some of the mistakes that Rob made. And one of the mistakes he made was, like his colleagues in that department meeting on January 6th, assuming that he didn't have enough time to teach information literacy. However, I do not want to perpetuate that sitcom trope where there's the bumbling doofus of a husband who always gets it wrong, and then the know-it-all wife who always gets it right. So I want you to know that Rob came up with the solution to this problem. He did some soul searching, and he realized you can make the time to teach information literacy if you really want to. It doesn't have to be a whole unit. It would be awesome if it was, but Rob realized he could carve out a week for information literacy instruction. And okay, realistically, maybe just 4 days. And then in the end, it was really only 3 days, but 3 days is better than no days for sure. But as you know, there were still some more obstacles to overcome, because in this solution, the key phrase is, if you really want to. Rob realized he was using that not having enough time as an excuse. And so were some of his colleagues, because of these other obstacles. Rob realized that if he cut something out of what he was already teaching, it would be something the thing he cut would be something he'd already taught many times before, something he felt really comfortable teaching, something he knew the students would respond well to. And if he replaced it with this information literacy thing, it would be something that he hadn't taught before, something he wasn't as comfortable teaching, and he didn't really know how the students were going to respond to it. And he realized the actual obstacle was not feeling confident or competent when it comes to teaching information literacy, because it's something you didn't learn about in teaching school. And it's really abstract, and it's changing all the time. And that list could go on and on. I think the situation is actually really similar to teachers being asked to teach social emotional learning, which some of you may be doing or have been asked to do. Yes, it's super important. And yes, you know that if the students don't learn about social emotional stuff in your class, they may never learn it. And yes, you do know some things about it because you have emotions and you interact with people socially, but you were never trained to teach this stuff. Where is all that background knowledge that you need to pass it on to other humans? And it can be the same with information literacy. Yes, it's important. And if they don't learn about it in your class, they may never learn it. And you do know some things about it because you consume information, you produce it, you definitely encounter misinformation. But what happens when that one student starts asking questions and you don't know the answers? Or when they all start asking questions and you don't know the answers? Those answers, maybe they weren't covered in that lesson plan or that PowerPoint that you got this morning at 7 a.m. and you had to scramble to get ready to teach. So it brings us back to this other obstacle, because it takes time to learn new content well enough to teach it. So what are some solutions to these obstacles? Well, one solution would be release time with per diem pay. And while we're at it, we'd also like our own sparkly unicorn, please. Although I really, really hope that this grant project that I'm working on, I hope it will be able to provide some teachers with that sparkly unicorn of release time. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, here's another solution to the obstacle of needing to learn new content before you teach it. Just tackle one thing at a time. If we go back to that marriage analogy, people don't usually get married on their first date unless they're a Kardashian. You take it slow at first, and you get to know each other better. This is a fairly accurate, but by no means complete, depiction of all the information literacy. And if you look at it like this, it's totally overwhelming, but you don't have to cover all of this, and definitely not right away. So you could pick one thing and just focus on that. You might focus on thinking critically about information sources for academic research. And that's super non-overwhelming, but it's probably something you are already doing. It's very social studies-y. You can just make it maybe a little more married to information literacy. And then when you feel confident about that, then you move on to another thing. And maybe that's going to be real world consequences of misinformation in historical contexts. That's still pretty social studies-y. It's not full-blown information literacy. You're talking about history. That's in your comfort zone. You just gave it a little bit more of an information literacy flavor. And then as you gradually move farther away from that social studies comfort zone, you might, when you're ready, you might tackle something like, how do social media algorithms work? So that's getting pretty information literacy-ish. That might be something you don't know as much about. You have to acquire more content knowledge yourself before you can start teaching it. But you're still just taking one thing at a time. And then when you're ready, you can move on to, there it is, the thing that's pure information literacy. It's something like reverse image searching. And maybe you already are there. I'm just saying you don't have to get there right away. These are all just suggestions for where to start. I just want to show it's less overwhelming if you say, well, I'm just going to deal with this. I'm not going to worry about the other stuff. And also if you start with the stuff that's more social studies-y and work towards the information literacy things. So that's why I kind of arranged all these little bubbles this way. So you can see at the bottom, it's pretty social studies-y. And then as you go up, it gets more and more information literacy-ish. I want to acknowledge that scope and sequence across grade levels is also really important. I've been seeing the chat, some folks are saying, but what do I do with the elementary students? How do I make things different from middle school, from high school? That is all super important. In fact, it's such a big deal. It's kind of a whole other conversation that I really hope we can have another time. In the meantime, let's move on to another solution. We differentiate for students all the time, but you can differentiate for yourself. And here is how I like to think of differentiating. I think of it in terms of what level of spiciness are you ready for? We can start with a super mild green chili at the bottom. And one way that you can differentiate for yourself is to think about how much you want to be directly involved in students' learning, how much you want to be the one explaining things and then answering their questions. So let's say you want to start at this very mild end of the spiciness spectrum. You could do self-directed activities with built-in assessments, such as the one from the News Literacy Project, which is, I've seen the shout out for them in the chat. They have this great thing called Checkology, and you don't have to interact with the students at all. It's kind of like plug and play for the students. This resource, the other ones I'm going to talk about, we've seen them in the chat. They're also going to be in that Google Doc for you. So this is one option. But then maybe when you are, you want to get a little spicier, you could move on to some of those videos from the Crash Course series that we've seen recommended as well. But maybe you want to provide them with some check for understanding assessments. So now you're doing a little bit more interacting with the students. You're letting John Green do the actual instruction for you, but then you are going to look at the responses that they're having and interact with them about that. And then spicier still, we're getting up into the 2 chili range. You could do some of those ready to go lessons, such as the civic online reasoning, which people are loving so much. So with those, you are interacting with the whole class, you're doing the instruction. But one of the things that's so great about them is they give you this script that you can follow. So you kind of have that as a support. And then all of this is in that Google Doc. And then when you are ready to go full habanero, you can try to adapt and create your own lessons. You would be leading discussions with the students, you would be off script. And of course, some of you may already be at this stage in your relationship with information literacy, but it's okay if you're working towards it wherever you are on that spiciness level. All right, so here's one way of thinking about the spiciness. It's that level of responsibility on you. But here is another way that we've also already seen some chat about in the chat. So another way to think about spiciness is it's not just how ready you are to tackle the content, it's how politically charged that content is. And believe it or not, a solution we're going to look at has to do with a different type of animal, which is adorable kittens. But first, let's look at this pretty daunting obstacle. As you know, the act of debunking misinformation is sometimes seen as a political act. Unfortunately, teaching students to think critically about information or anything with the word critical in it these days is seen as a declaration of a political allegiance, an abandonment of being neutral. It's kind of like how sometimes your friends or family, they don't really like that person that you want to marry, and so you have to bring them around. If you're looking to start at the milder end of the politically spicy spectrum, here is a possible solution. You can engage students with examples that are less fraught, that maybe have nothing at all to do with politics and are more fun. You may eventually work your way towards the more fiery stuff or be ready to dive right in. But there are other options, and most of them have to do with animals, which is the second most popular topic on the internet, right after politics. So if you want to teach students how to fact check, you could start with stories like these. Did scientists really train cows to use a toilet? Did these elephants really get drunk and fall asleep in a field? Did this parrot really learn how to order groceries on Alexa? Did Google really ban pictures of cats from the internet? Let's actually pause for a moment. Some of you might need a little stretch break, but take a moment. Let me see what you have to say in the chat. Which one or more of these stories do you think is true? At least one of them is true. So just based on your own critical thinking skills, which ones do you think are true? Go ahead and tell me in the chat, which ones are true? What do we think? A lot of cow toilets. Seeing the parrots, seeing the drunk elephants, ooh, everything but the cats. Oh yeah, man. They can't ever ban cats from the internet. Awesome, a lot of good guesses. The internet is indeed made of cats. If they banned cats, the whole internet would fall apart. They could never do that. Love it. Yeah. And I'm not giving you a whole lot to go on, but it's just fun to see how even these stories that are just kind of, fun or funny stories about animals, there's still totally good options for practicing those fact-checking skills. All right, you ready to see which ones are true? Here we go. Those drunk elephants, they weren't really lying down in a field. They weren't really. And yeah, the cat story wasn't true, but yes, scientists got cows to use toilets and a parrot was ordering groceries on Alexa. So this would be a mild, non-spicy way to ease into information literacy activities. when you're ready for that spicier end of the spectrum, which might be right now, here is another solution. And this has also been suggested already. I'm just going to reinforce it. Use examples, news stories, social media posts, other information sources from both ends of the political spectrum. I saw a shout out for this resource earlier, allsides.com. It's in the Google Doc, as well as some other suggestions for how to find those examples from both ends of the spectrum. Because it can be a little bit of a mini obstacle for us as well to think about, well, this looks pretty reasonable to me, and it can be very helpful to have these other guides to hear what other people are saying about these sources. We definitely want to be fighting misinformation no matter which side, which end of the spectrum it's coming from. All right, so if we go back to our spiciness meter, you can see that you can introduce a skill, what you actually do when you fact check with stories about hilarious animals. And then the spicier option is to use that same skill on stories that have more political content. And some of you may have students who are ready to engage with those strong political views. They can go straight for those hot topics without risking a shouting match in the classroom or in a school board meeting. Oh, and there's a resource in the Google Doc, Common Sense Media has some curriculum about civil discourse, which could also be really helpful. All right, but if you're not quite ready for that, you can get students started on a skill like reverse image searching to see if an image is a real image or not, with images like this one of a puppy with a tail growing out of its forehead. You do not have to go straight for the really spicy pictures like this one of Trump supporters wearing t-shirts that say they'd rather be Russian. Can if you want to, you don't have to. P.S. Both of these pictures are real. All right, so we're almost done. How am I doing? Oh, wow, look at the time. Okay. I know we started a little bit later. I do have just a little bit more to go through before I get to some questions. But I want to do a quick check. So far, we've looked at 4 obstacles, 6 solutions. That means there's one more obstacle left. It is a doozy. As if the political landscape wasn't tricky enough to navigate, we're also dealing with some obstacles that have to do with the developmental stages that our students are going through. Namely, teens tend to put up defenses if they feel like their identities or the groups they identify with are being criticized or even just examined. Now, needless to say, this is true of a lot of adults as well, not just teens, but teens are going through developmental stages where defining their identity is practically a full-time job. And so a big part of what they're doing as they establish that sense of self is find groups or communities that they identify with, and those communities, they come with sets of beliefs. So for teens, if you're challenging something that they believe, it can feel like you're stabbing their favorite teddy bear. It may seem perfectly reasonable to you to say, well, you shouldn't believe this. It's not true. But what they may be hearing is, I want you to reject this group of people with whom you strongly identify. And that's when those big old defenses might go up. So here's a possible solution. We can teach about some of the contexts that build a foundation for information literacy before ever getting to any specific examples of misinformation. I'm going to show you a little bit about one of those concepts. But also, if we go back to our spiciness meter, we can also think of it in terms of, how are the teens going to react? Are they going to welcome it with open arms? Or is it maybe going to trigger some defenses for them, maybe even some hostility? Let's look at what's going to be at that less spicy end of the spectrum. I'm thinking about topics like cognitive psychology. And I'm putting that in the semi-spicy category, the red and green chilies. It's possible to teach about these concepts. We've heard about backfire effect, confirmation bias. There's also cognitive dissonance. We can teach about those things without actually bringing up specific examples or specific beliefs. So you can say, look at this thing humans do. Look at how the human brain works. Isn't that wild? And then after you've learned about this thing the brain does, when you're ready to turn up the heat, you can get more personal. You could say something like, I'm going to tell you about a time when I experienced some cognitive dissonance. And I was able to step back from it and say, oh, wow, that was cognitive dissonance. And then you could say to the students, can you think of a time when you have experienced some cognitive dissonance? Oh, also remember this solution. You can add solutions together. So you could introduce something like cognitive psychology with a fun example, like face pareidolia, which is that thing where our brains make us see faces in inanimate objects, like this one and this one and this one. Or you could teach them about the Mandela effect, which is that thing where we're convinced we remember something that never happened. So many people think it was Berenstain Bears. It is and always was Berenstain Bears. The Monopoly guy doesn't have a monocle. Kit Kat does not have a hyphen. These are fun examples of cognitive psychology. And then you can get to the more serious, heavy stuff, like the backfire effect. There's a comic from the Oatmeal. It's in the Google Doc. I love it. It's this long, long vertical comic. It explains these things really well. And here is one more solution I want us to talk about, is to find things that you can agree on. It's one more solution to that obstacle of teens putting up defenses. We just looked at some examples of some things that we should be able to agree about when it comes to cognitive psychology. So we should be able to agree our brains make us do things unintentionally. And people tend to believe what they want to believe. We're not saying whether these are good or bad. We're just saying they really do happen. So what else could we agree on? Believe it or not, we can agree there are settled facts that are not up for debate, although some things are harder to settle than others. Now, I had a whole lesson about how to get to this agreement. I really, really wish I could do the whole thing for you, but we're almost out of time. So I'm just going to give you a tiny little preview, but you can find the whole thing in the Google Doc. All right, so in this lesson, we use a spectrum that has extremely settled facts at one end, statements that are extremely up for debate at the other end. We talk about three possibilities for how we might determine whether facts are settled or up for debate. One of the options is letting the majority decide. If we do that, that is how we end up with it once being a settled fact that geese grew on trees and that Brussels sprouts contained evil spirits, so a little bit of a problem with that one. We talk about how people with lived experience know what's true instead of just thinking something's true, but also how our perceptions can deceive us. Like when we look at these concentric circles and our brain tells us it's a spiral. We talk about how experts with data have gotten it wrong many times, but they do eventually get it right because they adjust when new data emerges. And the most important thing is finally we talk about why we consider these things. It's so when we're discussing articles like this one, we have a shared understanding, a shared vocabulary that we can use about these things that we have agreed on. It's so we can ask questions like, well, where would we put the statement, there has been a rise in anti-Asian violence? If we take that statement, where do we put it on the spectrum of being settled or up for debate? If we're saying it's settled, how has it been determined that it is a settled fact? Who are the experts? What is their data? And what do the Asian American people who have the lived experience have to say? Because it is so important that those voices be heard. So it creates a foundation for having these conversations because you've looked at them in a more neutral context, and then you bring them to the more charged conversation. Oh my gosh, I really, really, really wanted to show you this super fun activity about perspectives and bias that involves drawing objects on a table from different angles. But we've run into that pesky obstacle of time. So here's a summary of the solutions we've looked at today. Don't forget to check the Google Doc. And I would love to hear your questions. I would also love to hear if there are any obstacles that we haven't tackled yet. I will stop talking and see what questions John wants me to answer. Let's see, I am going to so, and Chong, I can't hear you. I might be in the wrong place.
Let me try that again.
Okay, great.
I was plugged in and not plugged in. All right. So, hey, welcome. Thank you again, Leslie, for that presentation. I think it was a lovely way to kind of wrap up, take a look at some of the obstacles, and I appreciate your solutions. I appreciated the way you sort of reframed things for us and gave us options about where we could enter this work. That's really important work. I do want to ask one question from Danetta before we turn to additional ones. But Danetta asked that students are hungry for this and they still have lots of questions that are hard to answer. How do you get comfortable with that? Like even at a like a low level, one chili pepper introduction.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a big part of not expecting it to happen right away. But I think it really is a matter of just practicing. Just the more you have those conversations, and you can start maybe with folks who you already have kind of a relationship built on trust with, and say, I really want to discuss this, but I'm not sure how to have the conversation. To practice with other people, practice with your fellow educators, practice with librarians who could maybe help you out. I wish there was a magic wand for making it more comfortable. It's also just, unfortunately, I don't know, it's maybe going to be uncomfortable. And we've talked about just kind of leaning into that discomfort and being open and honest about it as well, and saying, yeah, this is kind of hard for me to talk about. I'm figuring out how to talk about it with you. Getting feedback from the students is so incredibly important. I wish I had like the perfect answer, but it's complicated. It's all of the above. It's practice, but also know there's always going to be some discomfort, and maybe accept that discomfort.
All right. I am going to go ahead and run through the chat with a couple more questions. I do want to make sure that we wrap up in a few minutes.
Yes.
To give folks enough time if they'd like
sure.
to join us for the optional viewing party to go get their lunches and snacks and get their stretches in. But Tom Baltzel also wanted to know one issue. I'm just going to read this. One issue that he has is that I'm off social media completely because I think it creates a lot of problems and worry about my future digital addictions once step in. But most of our focus today has been on the validity issues with news shared on social media. It's like we need to consider creating a sort of a dummy Instagram account to get lost in the weeds and figure out how to navigate that. Is that a recommendation you might have to keep plugged in so that students know?
Oh yeah, if you want to know what's going on, but you don't want to have to dip into that world yourself. Ooh, I would say it's a great time for students to be a resource for you as well. I for a long time did not have TikTok, and my teenage niece would come over and I would be like, I need some TikTok, give me some TikTok, and she would kind of help me out with some of the things that were going on. So you can definitely use some other people as resources. I totally understand not wanting to be on it yourself, but there's ways to kind of stay connected with what's going on, reading articles coming out about what's going on all the many different social media platforms. But honestly, talking to the students is really the best way, because that's also how you know which ones they are mostly using. What are they mostly seeing? The example we saw with Sean and Liz of examining your own media environment, that can also be a useful tool for the educators to look at what the students are coming up with.
All right, we have another question here from Liliana in the chat. Perhaps you could address, how do you respond to and then de-escalate while normalizing, students' emotional responses to this process? Like if you do run into that.
Oh, for sure. I've used this idea that when we talk about critical thinking, we're talking about using our heads, but we absolutely cannot separate it from our emotions. This does get emotional. And so I think to just acknowledge that, and to not try to say, you shouldn't be emotional about that. But a trick that we use as librarians is to just say, tell me more. Tell me more about what's going on for you. Tell me more about what led to this feeling. And then when they say, if they're willing to share that with you, just to keep saying, oh, and tell me more about why that is true for you. Tell me more about that. So often that listening process and being heard, it's not necessarily going to make everything be perfect. But okay, all right. But it is it's a good way to start to be listening and acknowledging what students are saying without like trying to make them feel a different way. And then just to come back to the conversation, find what you can agree on. I'll go back to that. Find the things that you can agree on and use those as a starting point.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Leslie. I'm going to wrap up here with our last question. Gordon asked a couple of questions, and I think we all feed off of what our students give us in those aha moments. What have been student responses to like this teaching or these lessons or this material?
Well, I think the thing that came up earlier, definitely with the students I've worked with, has been this cynicism of like, well, I just don't believe anything. And that is as much of a problem as believing everything. Like they're both problems. I love that idea of healthy skepticism. I do have some activities that I do with students to help them explore their own levels of trust. And a lot of them will say, I just don't trust anything. And we'll talk about, well, so how's that working out for you? Just to really investigate, like, what could be some problems with not trusting anything ever? And more of that, like, well, where is that coming from? Is it just because you're so bombarded with misinformation? What does help you to get back to some feelings of trust? Because it might be different things for different students. Trying to individualize it as much as possible, I think.
Awesome. Well,
these are great questions. Oh my gosh, I really hope people will stay in touch. I really like talking about everything information literacy. I learned so much from working with teachers. I really appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you so much. And folks, and Leslie and all our presenters today, we can in fact continue the discussion on our discussion forum. OER has a link. Sarah just shared it again for anyone who'd like to, again, continue this conversation beyond the hours of our day here. I do want to just a quick wrap up and a thank you to all of our partners here. Obviously, the Washington State Council for Social Studies is so thankful to all our presenters. We are thankful to OER as well for partnering with us and making this entire morning possible. And thank you to all of you for coming and taking your Saturday to join us to do this really sort of important work. I hope it was feeding you as much as it was something that you can then share with your students. So I think that's as important, to sort of feed our social studies minds and brains and hearts too. We are going to have an optional lunch viewing party. So I've pulled some resources material that I've used in my classroom or think are intriguing. If you want to take a 15-minute break, grab some lunch, get a stretch in, take a look at the rain or whatever the weather's doing outside your windows and doors. Feel free to do that. If you'd like to come back in at 12:10, we're going to have a very sort of casual viewing party conversation and chat about some more material, particularly dealing with social media and misinformation, because that's been in the news lately. And so we'll dig right into that after our break. But otherwise, I want to thank you all, for those of you exiting for the morning. Thank you for joining us.